Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. If these stories bring you comfort, a like and a subscribe means the world, and it helps more people find their way to the fireside. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. And I'd love to know, do you believe in fairies? Or have you ever had a moment, just a flicker, where you wondered if they might be real? So settle in, pull the covers a little closer, let the room grow still around you. Outside, the spring evening is soft and darkening over the hills of Perthshire. The River Forth moves quietly below, and somewhere above the village of Aberfoyle, a path climbs through oak woodland toward a small hill that stands apart from the rest, rounder than the others, quieter, watching. Tonight we are going to follow that path, and we are going to follow the man who walked it more than anyone else, a minister of the church, a scholar of the Gaelic language, a seventh son. His name was Robert Kirk, and the story of what happened to him, what he wrote, what he believed, and where he went on the evening of the 14th of May, 1692, is one of the most extraordinary in all of Scottish folklore. Let us begin. There is a village at the edge of the Highland line, not quite the lowland Scotland, not quite Highland, a threshold place. On one side, the softer farms and rivers of the Forth Valley, where the land opens and breathes, and the Forth begins its slow, broad journey to the sea. On the other, the mountains begin to rise, the glens deepening into shadow. The old Gaelic-speaking world that had been there long before anyone drew borders on a map. The Trossachs, Queen Elizabeth Forest Park, we call it now. In the 17th century, it had no such name. It was simply the Highland Edge, and it had its own rules. The village is Aberfoyle, and in the year 1644, in the manse beside the old stone church, a boy was born. He was the seventh son of James Kirk, the minister of the parish. In Highland tradition, the seventh son was no ordinary child. He came into the world already carrying something, a closeness to what lay on the other side of ordinary seeing, a gift or a weight, depending on how you held it. His name was Robert. He grew up in sight of the hill behind the church, Doon Hill, the locals called it, Doon Shean in Gaelic, the fairy knowe, a round, conical hill that sits slightly apart from the landscape around it, in the way certain places do, as though they have stepped forward from the ordinary background of the world to be noticed. The oak woodland that clothes its slopes is old, twisted and mossy, and hung with lichen in the way of Atlantic oakwood that has been left to itself for a long time. The hill rises from relatively flat ground, which makes it visible for a considerable distance and makes it feel from below rather as though it is watching. The people of Aberfoyle knew perfectly well what lived there, or rather, what lived beneath it. They were not romantic about it. They did not discuss it lightly. You did not take earth from a fairy hill, or wood, or so much as a handful of grass. You treated those places with the careful respect you would show to a neighbour whose temper you had reason to know. And you did not, generally speaking, go walking there alone in the dark. Robert Kirk went there often. He grew up and left for the south to study, Edinburgh first, where he took his Master of Arts degree in 1661 at 17 years old. Then St Andrews, reading theology. His parents were poor. His father was a country minister, not a wealthy man, but Robert was able to go to school, then to the high school in Dundee, and eventually to university on a bursary granted by the Presbytery of Dunblane. He was a scholarship boy in the old sense, someone who got through on the quality of his mind and the willingness to work, keeping himself awake through the night when he had to, racing ahead of anyone who might overtake him. He was ordained in 1664 and given his first parish, Balquidder, a few miles north of Aberfoyle, in a narrow glen threaded by a loch and hemmed in by mountains. Another Gaelic-speaking community, another place where the old beliefs ran deep and were spoken of as naturally as the weather, as naturally as the name of the loch or the direction of the wind. Kirk settled there and began the quiet, steady work of a Highland parish minister, preaching, visiting, recording births and deaths, keeping the small community in its rhythm through the years. He spoke to his parishioners in their own language. That mattered. Not all ministers of the church in the 17th century Highlands were Gaelic speakers. Kirk was not translating himself. He was one of them, native and rooted. He married a woman named Isabel Campbell, daughter of Sir Colin Campbell of Maucaster, in 1678. They had one son, Colin, and he began quietly and diligently to do something no one had done before, to give the Gaelic-speaking people of the Highlands their own psalms, translated with care and elegance into their native tongue, set to metre so they could be sung in worship as they had always been sung in other languages, carrying the breath of the congregation through the familiar words. The work was painstaking. Kirk laboured over it for years, keeping himself awake through the night at times, we are told, to stay ahead of a rival translation being prepared by the Synod of Argyll. There was competition, ecclesiastical politics, the usual human friction running beneath the spiritual endeavour. The finished Psalter was published in Edinburgh in 1684. It was the first complete metrical translation of the Psalms into Scottish Gaelic for the Gaelic-speaking Highlands, who had only ever heard scripture in a language not entirely their own. This was a profound gift. a gift of recognition, the sense that the faith they held was speaking back to them at last in their own voice. But grief had come in between. Isabel died on Christmas Day, 1680. Robert was 36 years old. He was left with their son Colin, and whatever private sorrow a man does not speak aloud, he carved her epitaph himself, which tells you something about a person. Not everyone could do that. Not everyone needs to. Most people let someone else find the words. Kirk picked up the chisel. He remarried, a daughter of Campbell of Fordy, and in 1685 he came home, back to Aberfoyle, back to his father's parish, his father's church, his father's manse, back to the hill he had looked at every day of his childhood, the rounded shape of Doon Hill, rising above the village, its oak trees thick and dark in summer, skeletal against winter light, and always, always there. He was 41 years old, and he had the rest of his life ahead of him, or so it seemed. What he did not know, could not know, was that he had 7 years, 7 years to the month. In 1689, Robert Kirk made a journey south to London. London in 1689 was a city in motion. The glorious revolution had just placed William and Mary on the throne. The coffee houses of the city buzzed with the new ideas of the age. John Locke's philosophy was circulating. The Royal Society was conducting its experiments, and a cool, measured rationalism was settling like morning light over the educated world. The old explanations were being pushed aside. Miracles, spirits, second sight, the unseen world. These were becoming the province of the credulous, the provincial, the superstitious. Smart men in London were learning to smile at such things. Kirk had come to London to supervise the printing of the Gaelic Bible, a project begun decades earlier under the direction of Bishop William Bedell, and now nearing completion. The printing was funded by Robert Boyle, the same Robert Boyle whose experiments with air pumps and vacuums were helping to build the architecture of modern science. Boyle was a man of deep Christian faith, as well as a deep scientific curiosity, and when Kirk came to his door, Boyle was interested in something beyond the Gaelic Bible. He was interested in second sight. He had heard through a Scottish lord named George Mackenzie, Viscount of Tarbut, about the strange and persistent Highland tradition of an Da Haila, the two sights. Boyle wanted to understand it. Was it real? Could it be studied? What exactly did these Highland seers see? Stand for a moment in the coffee house where Kirk might have sat, across a table from Robert Boyle, steam rising from cups, the smell of tobacco and wood smoke, the particular noise of London, carts over cobbles, voices in a dozen languages, the press of a city, that never entirely quietens. The River Thames, carrying its grey cargo past the windows, and here, in the middle of it all, a Highland minister talking quietly about men who could see the dead, about doubles that walked beside the living, about beings as thick as atoms in the air that most people simply could not perceive. It is not difficult to imagine the conversation. Boyle was not an idiot, and neither was Kirk, and each of them knew what the other represented. Boyle's world was the new one: measurement, experiment, the careful recording of observable phenomena, the slow accumulation of what could be proved. Kirk's world was older, rooted in a different kind of careful recording, a different kind of testimony. Two men across a table in a London coffee house, trying to find the language to speak to each other about what was real. Kirk would also have encountered, in those coffee houses and drawing rooms, the polite dismal of men who had decided that the old beliefs were simply mistakes to be corrected. The provincialism of it was visible from both directions. London was, to a man from the Highland edge, as foreign as the moon, and the easy scepticism of city men who had never sat in a croft at midnight and heard what Highland people heard struck Kirk, you sense from the writing, as a form of ignorance masquerading as sophistication. Whatever Boyle made of it, Kirk took the question seriously. He came home from London with something sharpened in him. He had seen what the new age thought of the old knowledge. He sat in the coffee houses. He had heard the polite scepticism, and he had returned to Aberfoyle, to his congregation, to his parishioners who spoke of these things, not as curiosities, but as facts of their daily lives, and he had begun to write. The book he wrote is called The Secret Commonwealth. He completed it around 1691. He did not publish it in his lifetime. It would not appear in print for another 123 years, until Walter Scott brought it out in a small edition of 100 copies in 1815. Andrew Lang gave it its now familiar title, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns and Fairies, when he edited a new edition in 1893. Marina Warner introduced a further edition in 2019. The book is still in print, it is still being read, and it is unlike anything else in the history of Scottish letters. Its full title alone tells you what kind of document it is: an essay on the nature and actions of the subterranean, and for the most part, invisible people, heretofore going under the names of fauns and fairies or the like, among the low country Scots, as described by those who have the second sight. Kirk was not writing fairy tales. He was not collecting quaint stories for the amusement of city readers. He was building an argument. His subtitle gives it away. The book was an essay, he wrote elsewhere. written to suppress the impudent and growing atheism of this age. Kirk was an Episcopalian minister in a century that was watching its certainties erode. If God existed, then the spirit world existed. If the spirit world existed, then the evidence of it must be found somewhere, in the testimony of credible witnesses, in the consistent accounts gathered from people who had no reason to lie, in the traditions of the people who had lived alongside these things for longer than anyone could remember. The fairy folk, Kirk believed, were proof that the invisible world was real. And if the invisible world was real, then atheism was wrong. He was using folklore as theology. But let us set the argument aside for a moment and simply listen to what he says. The beings Kirk describes, the she, the good people, are not the delicate winged creatures of Victorian sentiment. They are not sweet, and they are not small, and they are not decorative. They are beings, Kirk says, of a middle nature betwixt man and angel, intelligent, organised, living in communities beneath the earth, with their own marriages, their own children, their own griefs, their own conflicts. Their bodies, he tells us, are made of something he calls condensed cloud, pliable and changeable, able to appear or vanish at will, best seen at dusk when the light is neither one thing nor the other. They wear clothes of the same cut and colour as their human neighbours. They speak Gaelic. They move among us constantly, as thick as atoms in the air. They have no religion, Kirk notes, and they are repelled by the words and objects of Christianity. Their tools and weapons are made of flint, for they cannot bear iron. They travel at the turning of the quarter year, the old seasonal divisions of the Celtic calendar, moving to new lodgings at Imbolc, at Beltane, at Lunasa, at Samhain, their chameleon-like bodies swimming through the air with their belongings, disturbing the seers who happen to walk out on those nights and cannot avoid them. Kirk records that some people in his congregation had taken to going to church, particularly on the first Sunday of each quarter, to be cleansed and protected against the wandering fairy tribes as they moved. Faith in the old belief, braided together, holding each other up. They have their own feuds and wars. They suffer grief and passion. They procreate. Their social structure resembles a human community closely enough that Kirk can describe it in familiar terms. Clans, households, a kind of political organisation beneath the earth. And they harvest. They take the essence of human crops and cattle without the humans noticing, leaving the physical substance, but removing whatever inner quality made it nourishing. Livestock can be elf-shot, struck with invisible flint arrows, and sicken without apparent cause. Fields can produce grain that looks full and golden, but leaves people thin, and they die, or at least they vanish from that state. Kirk is careful here. He does not claim to know what happens to the fairy folk at the end of their long lives. He only notes that they live much longer than humans, and that eventually they do not. There are two concepts in the book that have stayed in the imagination of readers ever since. The first is the co-walker. Every person alive, the tradition holds, has a double living in the fairy realm, a being perfectly resembling them in every particular, following them as a shadow through their days. Seers can see both simultaneously, the person standing before them and the fairy double that walks beside them, slightly out of step with the human world, present and not present at once. Kirk calls this double, every way like the man, as a twin brother and companion, haunting him as his shadow. The double sometimes takes over entirely. It can inhabit the life of the person it mirrors, while that person is drawn away to fairyland. It can continue walking, eating, speaking, to all appearances, the person it has replaced, while the real human is gone, somewhere no one else can see. The stock, the people of Aberfoyle called this double, when it was left in place of a taken person, a changeling of a kind, but not a child, a hollow shape of the adult, sitting in the chair by the fire, speaking the right words, doing the expected things, and not quite there. The second concept is the joint eater, or the just haver. Kirk describes as a vocarious elf that attaches itself to a person who eats a great deal, feeding on the pith and quintessence of every meal before it reaches the person's stomach. That is why, Kirk tells us, certain people can eat and never put on flesh, always lean like a hawk or a heron, always hungry despite their appetite. There is a smaller, invisible mouth eating before them, taking the best of what they swallow. Read alongside each other, the co-walker and the joint eater paint a strange and unsettling picture of the invisible world, not a distant fairyland beyond the hills, something much closer, something shading your room, your table, your shadow, something that has always been there. Kirk speaks of the fairy hills, and Doon Hill specifically, with careful reverence. There be many places called fairy hills, he writes, which the mountain people think impious and dangerous to peel or discover by taking earth or wood from them. He knew the prohibition, he wrote it down, and still he walked there, evening after evening, in his nightgown, listening. Before we leave the book and step back into the man's life, we must speak of the second sight, because it runs through everything Kirk wrote like a thread of dark water. Doon Hill, the two sights, the gift, if it is a gift, of seeing beyond what ordinary eyes can perceive. Kirk gathered testimony from his parishioners at Aberfoyle and Balquidder, with the same careful attention he had given to the Gaelic Psalms. He asked, he listened, he wrote down what he heard. The men of that second sight do not discover strange things when asked, Kirk notes, but it fits and raptures as if inspired by some genius at that instant, which before did lurk in or about them. It cannot be commanded or withheld. A seer does not choose their visions. The vision arrives, and the seer endures it. What they see most often is the shroud, a man or woman seen with the winding cloth already drawn up to their chest or to their chin, or over their face entirely. The higher the shroud, the nearer the death. This is not a metaphor. The tradition held it as a literal and observable fact, something that could be seen by the right eyes at the right moment, as clearly as you might see a coat or a hat. Kirk records account after account of this. The vision is consistent across testimonies gathered from people who had not compared notes with each other. A man is seen with the shroud rising to his waist at midsummer. By autumn it has reached his throat. By the first frost he is gone. A woman argues with a seer who keeps looking at her with an expression she cannot read, not knowing what is being seen just above her shoulder. There is a story Kirk includes, not told at first hand, but too consistent to dismiss, of a seer and a minister walking together along a road. The seer suddenly tried to step aside, moving to the edge of the lane, apparently making room for something the minister could not see. The minister refused to step aside. He saw nothing in the road. He held his ground, and both men were thrown violently to one side, as though something had passed between them with force, brushing them both out of its way, like an irritated hand clearing a table. They see the co-walkers at the seasonal transitions, moving in procession, restless and unsettling. They see things standing at a person's shoulder that will only later be understood. A future husband, in one account Kirk records, standing beside a woman who does not yet know him, visible to the seer who watches, invisible to everyone else in the room. She married him in due course. He died shortly after, and the seer had known, had seen it in the shape of the figure at her shoulder from the beginning, and had said nothing, because what do you say? There is a letter from Lord Tarbet, George Mackenzie, Viscount of Tarbet, that Kirk includes in the Secret Commonwealth, written in response to Robert Boyle's inquiry into second sight. Tarbet was a Scottish nobleman who had witnessed these things himself during years spent in the Highlands, and he wrote about them with the careful, measured tone of a man who knows people will be sceptical and is determined nonetheless to report what he saw. The faculty, he tells Boyle, afflicts men, women, and children. Some acquire it at a certain age. Some are born with it Some seem to catch it from others, as though it were a contagion of perception rather than a fixed gift of birth. To many of those who carry it, it is not a gift, but a burden. As Tarbet wrote, there are many seers to whom second sight is a trouble, and they would be rid of it at any rate if they could. Consider what it would mean to carry such a thing, to walk into a room and see, at the shoulder of a friend you love, the white cloth already beginning to gather, to know and to have no way to prevent it, and no way to unknow it, to look at the world always with that second layer of sight pressing against the first, to see the co-walkers move at the turning of the quarter year, and to understand that only you in the room can see them, to keep your face still and say nothing, and carry the knowledge home. Kirk writes about the loss of second sight in emigration. People he knew personally, or knew of, who had carried the gift all their lives in the Highlands and found it suddenly absent when they crossed the ocean to Barbados or to the American colonies. Something about the land itself, the particular quality of the Highland ground and the Highland air, seemed to sustain the faculty. Away from it, the sight faded and eventually stopped altogether. The detail has stayed with many people who read it, as though the gift were not an internal property of the person, but a relationship between the person and the place, as though the land itself were part of the seeing. Whether Kirk himself had the second sight is a question he never answers directly in the text. He was the seventh son, which in Highland tradition was the clearest marker of the gift. He writes about some things with a closeness, a specificity that is hard to explain entirely as second-hand testimony. The book keeps its secrets in that regard, but the question is worth sitting with quietly for a moment in the dark. The 14th of May, 1692. It was a warm evening in spring. The hills above Aberfoyle were green and soft after weeks of growing weather. The River Forth ran clear and low over its stones. The manse stood where it always had, quiet in the evening light, and Robert Kirk, 48 years old, minister, scholar, seventh son, put on his nightgown and went out. He took the path he always took, down from the manse, across toward the old churchyard, and up through the oak woodland, toward the summit of Doon Hill. He had walked this path hundreds of times. He knew every root and stone and turning of it. His parishioners knew he walked it. They thought, many of them, that he walked too close to the hill, too often. They said it among themselves, the way you speak of a friend whose habits worry you, but whom you cannot quite bring yourself to warn. Because how do you explain such a thing? And what would you say? He did not come back. His body was found on the hill. The record says apoplexy, a sudden death at 48. His wife was pregnant with their second child, a daughter who would be born after her father was gone. He was buried in Kirkton churchyard, in the shadow of the old church he had served. The gravestone stands there still, the inscription in Latin, celebrating him as an accurate publisher of the gospel and a luminary of the Gaelic language. Coins are laid on it by visitors who are not quite sure why they leave them, but they leave them anyway. There is a carved thistle for Scotland, a shepherd's crook for his calling as a pastor, and a dagger, that small iron blade on the stone. Some think it refers to something else entirely. The people of Aberfoyle, though, knew what had happened. He had gone too close, too often. He had written down their secrets, the co-walkers, the joint eaters, the fairy hills, the second sight, the natures and habits and movements of the she, the good people, who had kept their own counsel since before memory began. He had set those secrets down in ink and passed them from hand to hand. The good people had taken him. What lay in the grave at Kirkton was a stalk, a shape, a hollow resemblance, a piece of the fairy art. The real Robert Kirk was somewhere under the hill. Shortly after the funeral, Kirk's ghost appeared to a relative. The account had been told in different versions in the years since, with different names attached to the cousin or the kinsman who received the visitation. But the shape of it is consistent. Kirk appeared and spoke. He told the man what he was told, in a tradition that carries the weight of genuine Highland belief. He was not dead. He was in fairyland, in the realm below Doon Hill, and he could not get out by his own will. But there was a way. He would appear at the christening of his posthumous child. That was the moment. The family would be gathered. The child would be brought to the baptismal water. And at the moment Robert Kirk appeared in that room, which he would do, he promised, Thomas Graham of Duchray, his brother-in-law, must act. He must throw an iron dagger over the apparition. Iron, the one substance the fairy folk cannot endure. Throw it over the figure of Kirk. Pass the iron through the space he occupied, and the spell would break. He would come back. He would step out of whatever in-between place he was held in and return to his life, to his wife, to his child who had never known him. The christening came. The family gathered in the house. The baby girl was there, and Robert Kirk appeared, exactly as he had said he would, a figure standing in the room among the people who had known him, solid enough to be seen, present in whatever form the dead, or the fairy taken, can be present. Thomas Graham saw him, and he did not throw the dagger. Whether it was terror or shock or the particular paralysis that overtakes the body when something impossible stands before it, we do not know. The book does not record what Graham felt. The story does not give us his face. We have only the fact of it, the knife in his hand, the figure in the room, and the moment passing in silence. Kirk's figure turned. He moved toward the door. He passed through it. He has not been seen since. Doon Hill stands above Aberfoyle, just as it always has. The path from the village climbs through oak woodland, mossy and quiet, the ground soft under the trees. At certain times of the year, the wild garlic comes up thick through the undergrowth, and the scent of it drifts through the air, along with the smell of wet bark and leaf litter, and something else, harder to name, that seems to belong specifically to this particular hill. At the summit, in a small clearing, stands a Scots pine, one tree, older than the others, standing apart in the clearing, like a figure that has stepped forward from the tree line to see better. Its bark is reddish-grey and deeply furrowed. Its branches reach out at angles that suggest long patience with wind. Around it, the other trees, mostly oak, are hung with ribbons and threads and scraps of cloth. Messages written on paper and tied to the branches. Wishes left for whatever is listening. The tradition of the clootie, the rag tied to a sacred tree as a prayer or a petition, is ancient in Scotland, and this hill has drawn it. This is the minister's pine, Kirk's tree. The tradition says his spirit is held within it, trapped between the fairy realm below and the human world above, serving still as chaplain to the fairy queen, as the story has always put it. Not freed, not gone, present in the tree, in the clearing on the hill, on whatever terms such a presence is possible. Coins are left at the foot of it, just as coins are left on his gravestone below. People come from considerable distances to stand in that clearing and look at the tree and feel whatever it is they feel. Some tie their own ribbons, some make a wish, some simply stand. The old church of Kirkton below is roofless now. The roof was taken off in the early 19th century when a new church was built in the village, and the old walls were left to the weather. But the churchyard is still tended. The mort safes are still there at the centre. The heavy iron cages that were placed over new graves in the grave robbing era to prevent the theft of bodies for the anatomy trade. Their presence has its own accidental irony on this particular ground. Down the hill, in the village, there is a pub called the Fairy Tree. The Tourist Information Board has a picture of Robert Kirk. The local walks are signposted with fairy mushrooms, Aberfoyle knows what it has, and yet the hill itself, when you reach the summit, stays quiet. It has not been turned into something cheerful. The ribbons flutter, and the coins catch the light, and the old pine stands in its clearing, and whatever is in the hill is not chatty about it. You can feel the age of the belief there, the weight of it. This was a serious place before it was a tourist attraction, and it remains, somehow, serious underneath. The book Kirk wrote is extraordinary, not only for what it contains, but for the way it was written. He was not a collector of fairy tales. He was not an entertainer or a romancer. He was a minister of the church, a scholar who had produced the Gaelic Psalter and supervised the Gaelic Bible, a man whose intellectual credentials were as solid as his community's respect for him. And he wrote about the fairy folk the way a careful naturalist might write about a species he had observed at close quarters for years. He described their diet, their social structure, their movements through the year, their relationship with humans, their aversions, their capacities. He gathered testimony with something that looks very much like what we would now call ethnographic method, asking questions, listening without mockery, recording what he heard as faithfully as he could. He did not dismiss the people who told him these things in an age when the educated world was learning to look down on the rural poor for their continuing belief in the unseen. Kirk looked at his parishioners with respect. David Bentley Hart, a contemporary philosopher and theologian, has praised Kirk for this, for writing the book as a defence of harmless Scottish country folk who innocently dabbled in the lore of their culture and found themselves called before the Presbyterian courts for it. Kirk was trying to protect something. He was trying to say, these people are not mad. They are not liars. The world they are describing is real. There is something quietly radical in that, when you hold it against the background of the age. The Enlightenment was going to come, and Kirk could see it coming. He had sat in its coffee houses. He had spoken with its leading figures. He knew what was being built, and he stood in his Highland parish and said, before this changes everything, let me write it down. Let me say what is here. Let me say what these people know. He did not quite succeed in convincing the skeptics of his age, but he preserved something that would have been lost. The accounts of co-walkers and joint-eaters and seers who see the shroud on a living person's chest. These are 17th century Highland testimonies, gathered directly from the people who carried the traditions, written down by a man who spoke their language and lived among them. There is no other document quite like it. Walter Scott brought it out in 1815, 123 years after Kirk wrote it, and the manuscript Scott used promptly went missing and has not been found since. Andrew Lang edited the 1893 edition, dedicating it to Robert Louis Stevenson, who would have known exactly what to do with a story like this. The 2019 New York Review Books edition, with Marina Warner's introduction, is the one currently in print. Stuart Sanderson and Marina Warner both called it one of the most important works on fairies and second sight ever produced. And the influence of the ideas run further than folklore scholarship. The concept of the co-walker, the shadow double, the version of you that walks in a parallel world, just out of sight, is an idea that keeps surfacing in literature. Philip Pullman's demons in his Dark Materials carry the echo of it. External souls, companions that are somehow more truly yourself than you are. Susanna Clarke's fairy in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell owes something to the cold, serious, dangerous fairy world Kirk was describing. A world without sentient, without whimsy, operating by its own logic in the darkness beneath human life. The ideas did not stay in Aberfoyle. They went out into the world with the book and found their way into things Kirk could never have anticipated. A 17th century minister in a nightgown on a fairy hill in Perthshire, and his ideas are still moving through the world. There is something that cannot be entirely resolved about Robert Kirk, and I think it would be wrong to try. He was a man who moved between two worlds, and not just in the metaphorical sense. He was educated at Edinburgh and St Andrews. He walked in London coffee houses with Robert Boyle. He understood the intellectual world of his age and its direction. He knew perfectly well what the Enlightenment meant for the old beliefs. He wrote the Gallic Psalter and the Gallic Bible with the rigour and care of a serious scholar. He was, in every formal measure, a man of his time and of the church, and he was the seventh son of a Highland minister, born in the shadow of a fairy hill, who kept returning to that hill on summer evenings in his nightgown, listening. He knew, because he wrote it down, that the hill was considered dangerous. He knew the prohibition. He knew what his parishioners believed about what lived beneath it, and what it thought of humans who came too close. He recorded all of it with a careful pen, and then he went back up the path again and again. Was he afraid? Was he certain of protection that turned out not to hold? Was there something in him, the seventh son, the man who had spent 20 years listening to seers, that could not quite help going to see? The stone in the churchyard says he died at 48. The people of Aberfoyle say otherwise, and have said otherwise for more than 300 years. Catherine Briggs, the great English folklorist, noted in the 1970s that people in Aberfoyle were still saying it then. that if you crossed the humpbacked bridge near the fairy hill, you might sometimes feel a weight come down on your back, a burden, the soul of the minister, begging to be set free. The dagger that Thomas Graham did not throw is carved on the gravestone. The iron he failed to use is remembered in stone, and the pine tree stands on the summit of the hill with its ribbons and its coins and its long patience, and says nothing. What we know is this: he was a man who took the old world seriously enough to walk into it. The book he wrote survived him. It found its way into print more than a century after his death, and has never been out of the conversation since. The tradition that keeps him in the hill keeps coins on his grave and ribbons on his tree and wishes murmured at the summit. That tradition is not going anywhere either. There is a gift in what he did. Whether you believe the story of the fairy hill or you do not, he listened without contempt. He wrote without mockery. He stood between the new world and the old one and tried to say, both of these things are real. The world is larger than any single account of it. In the understanding of those who knew the hill, he paid for it. In the understanding of everyone who has read the book, in the 330 years since, he gave us that something beyond a price. Let the fire settle now. Let the room go quiet around you. Outside, it could be any spring evening in the Trossachs. The oak trees are putting on their new leaves, pale green and tender against the darker pines. The river Forth moves under the old bridge. The path up the hill is just as it was, mossy and root-crossed, the light failing slowly through the canopy, the air cool and smelling of leaf mould, and something green and sharp underneath it. The clearing at the summit is just as it was. The old pine stands. Think for a moment of what it means that the tree is still there, that people still climb the hill, that coins are still placed on the grave below by people who have come from places Robert Kirk could not have imagined. To stand at a stone in a ruined churchyard in Perthshire and leave something of themselves, that the ribbons still flutter at the summit, carrying wishes in dozens of languages to whatever is listening in the tree. 330 odd years since a man walked up that path and did not come back. His book was not published until 123 years after he wrote it, and still the tradition lives. Still the hill holds what it holds. Robert Kirk walked up that path knowing what he knew, with all his learning and all his theology, and all the accounts of the seers and the co-walkers, and all the fairy hills he had been careful to describe. He walked up the path in the evening light, and somewhere in him, perhaps, was a man who wanted to see for himself, who had spent his life between two worlds and could not stop moving toward the one most people walked away from. He had grown up within sight of the hill. He had left it and come back to it more than once. He had written it all down. The beings in the hill, their organisation, their habits, their relationship with human beings, the co-walkers and the joint eaters, and the seers who could see them. And then he had gone back up the path in his nightgown on a warm spring evening for the last time. Was he afraid? There is no way to know. The record says nothing of his state of mind. What we have is the path, the hill, the body found at the summit, and the story that grew from it the moment the news spread through the village. A story that has never stopped growing. That is the kind of person who leaves a mark. Not the careful ones, not the ones who stay safely inside and write only what can be proved. The ones who go up the hill. What happened there is not resolved and never will be. The hill holds its answer in whatever language hills speak. But the book is there, the stone is there, the tree is there, and we are here on a spring evening in a room with a low fire, grateful that someone walked that path and wrote down what he found before the new world arrived to say there was nothing there to find. He did not succeed in convincing the skeptics of his age. The Enlightenment came anyway, as it was always going to. But in trying, he preserved something, the texture of a living belief, the specific shape of what the people of the Highland Edge knew and felt and saw before those ways of seeing were taught away or simply died with the people who had held them. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, almost everything. Rest now. Let the old stories settle around you, the way the dark settles over a hill at the end of the day, slowly and completely, without urgency. In Aberfoyle, the minister's pine stands in its clearing. The ribbons move a little in the night air. The coins lie still on the stone below. The ruined walls of the old church stand open to the weather, as they have always stood for 200 years, and the roofless nave holds its silence, the way certain places hold silence, not emptily, but fully. Whether Kirk is in that grave or somewhere else entirely, still serving, as tradition has it, as chaplain to the fairy queen in the realm below the hill, is a question the hill declines to answer. And perhaps, for now, that is exactly as it should be. If tonight's story has stayed with you If you find yourself wondering just a little about the path up the hill, please do leave a like and a subscribe. It brings these stories to more people, and there are so many more still to tell. I would love to know you were here. Good night from the fireside. Good night from Scotland. Good night.